Have you ever wondered how a single gunshot could plunge the entire world into chaos? In the years leading up to World War I, Europe was a simmering pot of tension. The rise of militarism, with nations building up their armies and navies, created an atmosphere of fear and competition. On top of this, a complex system of alliances added a dangerous layer of obligation and expectation. A conflict involving just two nations could easily drag in their allies, escalating the situation. At the same time, the thirst for empire was growing. Imperialism was on the rise, with European powers vying for control of overseas territories. This competition only served to heighten the tension. But it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary that lit the fuse. This act of violence was the spark that ignited the powder keg, and thus a single bullet set the stage for the Great War, a conflict that would redefine the world. As the world braced for the impacts of war, alliances solidified and battle lines were drawn. The year was 1914, a year that would forever be etched in the annals of history. The world was split into two major factions, the Allies and the Central Powers. The Allies, a coalition of nations including France, the United Kingdom and Russia, found themselves pitted against the formidable might of the Central Powers, composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, among others. The early days of the war were marked with a flurry of activity. In the west, the German forces pushed through Belgium, hoping to outflank the French army. This was known as the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed to prevent a two-front war. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy, and this was no exception. The German advance was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, a turning point that prevented the capture of Paris and set the stage for trench warfare, a horrifying testament to the brutal nature of this conflict. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russian army moved swiftly against both Germany and Austria-Hungary. Despite initial successes, they soon found themselves caught in a war of attrition they were ill-prepared for. The Battle of Tannenberg, a disastrous defeat for Russia, was a clear sign of the trials and tribulations they would face. The stage was set, and the players were in place. The initial battles had been fought, and the scale of the conflict was becoming apparent. Nations that had once enjoyed peace found themselves in the throes of war, their citizens becoming soldiers, their cities becoming battlegrounds. The war was just beginning, and already it was clear that this was a conflict like no other. As the war progressed, successes and failures ebbed and flowed on both sides. The year 1915 saw the Allies attempting a new strategy with the Gallipoli campaign. Their aim was to seize the Dardanelles, a strategic waterway, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. However, the campaign was a disaster, with heavy losses on both sides and no significant gains for the Allies. The following year, 1916, was marked by two of the war's most significant battles, Verdun and the Somme. The Battle of Verdun, primarily between the German and French armies, was one of the longest and most devastating battles in human history. Casualties on both sides reached well into the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of the Somme was equally destructive. The British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, making it one of the bloodiest days in the history of warfare. In the midst of these gruesome battles, new technologies were making their debut on the battlefield. Tanks, first used by the British at the Battle of the Somme, offered a way to cross trenches and navigate the war-torn landscapes. They were initially unreliable but showed potential for future warfare. Poison gas, introduced by the Germans, was another new and terrifying weapon. It was indiscriminate and deadly, causing widespread fear and chaos. The year 1917 saw continued fighting with no clear advantage for either side. The Allies launched a series of offensives on the Western Front, known as the Nivelle and Passchendaele offensives, but these resulted in high casualties and little strategic gain. The Central Powers also had their share of struggles, with political unrest and food shortages at home. The war had become a brutal stalemate, with neither side able to claim definitive victory. Through the bloodshed and horror, the world was beginning to realize that this was not a war that could be easily won, but one that would reshape nations and people in ways unimaginable. This was the grim reality of the tides of war. 1917 was a year of dramatic shifts in the war's dynamics. The United States, long observing the war from across the Atlantic, decided to join the fray. The entry of the United States was a game changer. America, with its massive resources and fresh troops, brought a renewed sense of hope to the beleaguered Allies. It was like a shot of adrenaline, infusing the Allied forces with much-needed strength and vigor. American involvement was not just about boots on the ground, It was about resources, industrial might, and a fresh perspective on the war. The United States was not worn down by 3 years of brutal conflict. Its troops were fresh, its factories humming, and its resolve unshaken. America's entry into the war was a beacon of hope for the Allies, a sign that they were not alone in their struggle. Yet as one power entered the stage, another one exited. Russia, one of the original members of the Allies, was going through its own internal turmoil. The Bolshevik Revolution was sweeping across the country, pulling Russia away from the global conflict and into a civil war of its own. The exit of Russia from World War I was a blow to the Allies, but it was a necessary sacrifice for the Russian people, who were eager for change and tired of war. Russia's exit was a shock, but it was not a death blow to the Allies. The United States' entry more than compensated for Russia's departure. It was like a seesaw, with one end going up as the other went down. The Allies lost a member, but they gained a powerful new ally, one that had the potential to tip the balance of power in their favor. With America's entry and Russia's exit, the balance of power was shifting. The Central Powers, once confident in their victory, were now facing a revitalized enemy. The tide of war was changing, and with it, the fate of millions. The year 1917 marked a turning point in World War I, setting the stage for the final act of this global conflict. By 1918, the world was longing for the end of the bloodshed. The final year of the war was a roller coaster of desperation and hope, as both sides strained to gain the upper hand. In the spring, Germany launched their last major offensive. It was a desperate gamble. They aimed to break the stalemate on the Western Front before the full force of the United States could be brought to bear. The German Spring Offensive, as it came to be known, initially brought significant gains, but as the spring turned to summer, the offensive lost steam. The Allies held fast, and the German forces found themselves overextended and exhausted. The Allies saw their opportunity and seized it. In the late summer, they launched the 100 Days Offensive. This series of rapid, decisive attacks pushed the Central Powers back, reversing much of the ground gained by the German Spring Offensive and then some. The tide of the war had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. By the fall, it was clear that the end was near. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The terms were harsh, demanding immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of German troops from all occupied territories. The once mighty Central Powers were left weakened and humiliated. But the signing of the armistice did not bring immediate relief. The world had been irrevocably changed. Empires had fallen, borders had been redrawn, and millions had been lost to the horrors of war. The world was left to grapple with the aftermath of a conflict the likes of which had never been seen before. Finally, the guns fell silent, marking the end of the Great War, but the impacts of this conflict would be felt for generations to come. The scars of the war ran deep, and its legacy would shape the course of the 20th century in ways that no one could have predicted. In the wake of the war, the world was forever changed. The ravages of World War I left a deep and indelible impact, with an estimated 15 to 20 million people losing their lives. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. This treaty, however, was viewed with resentment by the Germans, who were held responsible for the war and were burdened with heavy reparations. The war also triggered profound political and social changes. The map of Europe was redrawn, with new countries emerging from the ashes of the fallen empires. Societies were transformed, as women stepped into roles previously held by men, marking the beginning of significant shifts in gender roles. Yet, despite the devastation and the hope for lasting peace, the seeds of another, even more catastrophic conflict were sown. World War I was not the war to end all wars as many had hoped, but it was a war that changed the world forever.